Welcome to another episode of Getting Nosy with It. Today we're going to talk with Aaron Aubuchon from Webster University about fandom and horror. So welcome. What are some of your thoughts on fandom and horror?
Hi, thanks for having me.
Sure.
I appreciate it. When we think of genres that we're into, we often think of the materials that the genre produces, not so much maybe the culture that surrounds the genre. And I'm just really interested in subcultures. So I went to film school thinking that I was going to go to Africa and make films about African tribes. That was what I really thought my life was going to point towards. I ended up going to film school, and I ended up not doing that at all. I ended up making corporate work for the last 20 years, really. And then in the last few years, I've always been a fan of horror. I've always been a fan of the fantastical in general, but horror has been the thing that is really, and monsters specifically, have really fascinated me. And so I'm a child mostly of the 80s. I went to high school in the 80s. And most of my fandom kind of organizes itself around that time. You know, it's a formative time. So a few years ago, I got really interested in the fandom that has collected around the horror genre based on a presentation that I gave about Warren Publications. Warren Publications, there's Uncle Creepy right there. But Famous Monsters of Filmland, Creepy, Eerie, Vampirella, all of that stuff. And I gave this presentation about its impact on comic books. But I also, in doing that, talked a lot about how, you know, the shock theater package released to television in 1957-58, the creation of Famous Monsters of Filmland, and the fact that Jim Warren couldn't find any advertisers for him to fill out the pages of Famous Monsters, so he had to come up with his own thing. So he created this thing called Captain Company. So all those old Warren publications were just packed with nothing but horror stuff. And importantly, there was a place for kids to write in about, you know, just, hey, I love this movie, I hate that movie, I love this comic, I hate that comic, and it created this community. And so what I'm really interested in is the community. You know, you've got an almost universal response when you read about people who are into horror. And I'm sure that's true of just about any other fandom too, but kind of nerd fandom. But they all say the same things. I was a weirdo, nobody got me, nobody understood me. And then I found this place where everybody was into the same stuff I was, and I found my family, and I didn't feel like a weirdo, and that's my new home. So I'm making a documentary right now, actually, and I'm calling it Tribe of Terror, Family of Fear. And it's about the horror fandom, because I really do think that in the most positive ways, there's something tribal and familial about fandoms in general.
I think I read an article once, like the very first fan convention. It was like in 1937 or something, and like 7 whole people showed up or whatever. But you had those people, I think it was in New York, you know, coming together and saying, hey, we all like the same thing. And then obviously we're, you know, not quite 100 years later, but now you've got conventions going on almost every weekend about something. If it's not just a generic science fiction fantasy convention, it'll be horror, it'll be gaming, it'll be something, you know, D&D or whatever. I don't even know if they still have the Gen Con, but
yeah,
people are finding their people, right?
Exactly.
And together. And in our society, I guess when you do it for sports, it's normal, right? You dress up with a cheese head and you go, you know, and sit in 20 below weather to watch, you know, your team. That's ordinary and normal. But if you want to go to a horror convention or something, then maybe there's something wrong with you, right?
Well, it's interesting because it's becoming more and more normal. And I think for people like myself, and it sounds like yourself, it was sort of like, you know, there were these tribes, there were these communities that we had around us, and we went, I don't find that satisfying. Like, I just have never understood sports fandom. It's just, I don't look down on it because I really think it's just another fandom. But for me, I just don't get it. I mean, I could kind of understand it if you literally, if like your fandom was, hey, me and my uncle and my uncle's best friend and 2 of my brother's best friends, we all play on that team locally, and then our whole community kind of gets together and watches us play. But I've never really particularly understood the connection between, you know, 17 guys from the Dominican Republic, or what, you know, like people that I will never meet being super excited about that. That's just me. It's just I've never been able to connect to it. But I connect to it in that I realize that those people are just nerds, just like everybody else is. They're just nerdy about that thing, you know? So I certainly don't look down on sports fandom, and I find it interesting. I feel like it's going away a little bit, but I find it interesting when the people who are interested in the sports fandom look down on the other fandoms as being that way. Because it's like, come on, man, you're really the same person. You're the same as all the rest of us. It's just that yours has been traditionally more socially respectable. I think it's great that you mentioned, I think it was the World Science Fiction Convention, if I'm not wrong, and I think you're right, 1937. Forrest Ackerman was there. Forrest Ackerman was one of those 7 people that you mentioned that went to that thing. And, you know, he's also the guy that invented the term sci-fi, and he's also was the editor of Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine for most of its initial run. And I think it's interesting, too, if the history, I'm really fascinated with history. So the history of fandom has these sort of, I mean, it all comes from this sort of one central foundational point, and then it grows out into all these various branches. So the fandom of all the things that we think of, from Comic-Con to Horror Hound to all the kind of different big fan conventions that come together, all kind of come from the same root. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think people want to get together even when they can't. So I don't know if you've been part of the Consolation online, but last week someone decided since a bunch of the cons that should have been going on this spring are now canceled, they were just going to have an online virtual convention. So I think it's like 20,000 people are on this Facebook page now. And, you know, people are complaining about tribbles in the elevators and, you know, where's the masquerade going on and stuff like that. So they're pretending they're at a con, but they're having, you know, fun with 20,000 other people on Facebook, you know, doing their thing.
Well, you know, and I think that's the con experience to me. You know, it's interesting that when we think of cons, what we think about often is the experience of meeting some celebrity. And I don't think that's the important thing at all. The important thing about the con, I mean, that is what you end up, that's the pictures that you put up of yourself on social media. Here's me and blank. Here's me and Sid Haig or William Shatner, or pick a name. But the important thing is the conversations. You know, it's the capacity to meet with your tribe and have these conversations. You know, I've been going to cons for a very, very long time of various kinds. And I finally found my home con just in the last year or so. And it's Cinema Wasteland in Strongsville, Ohio. And when I go, I've been meaning to go to it for 20 years and I just never made it. And I finally went. And for me, to be able to find people who are that big a horror nerd, just like I am, people who can teach me something, like a lot of people who know more about this thing than I do, something that I've been actively studying for 30 years, is really exciting. And I come back from it just super energized. And it's cool to meet people. I mean, you know, over here on the wall, I've got a I Drink Your Blood poster that I got signed by the living, you know, most of the living cast of the film. And that's really cool to have. But much more importantly for me, and I think for most of the people I talk to, is the capacity to come back from that experience like, I've got 30 new movies to watch and 10 new books to read and all these things that I want to think about, and, you know, all these conversations I want to keep having. One of my favorite podcasts for the last year or so, a couple years, I guess, has been a podcast by a guy named S.A. Bradley, and it's called Hellbent for Horror. And he always talks about how he wants to create conversations with people. And I think that's exactly it. You know, you want to have conversations. This is about ways to share our passion.
Okay, I think you mentioned the meeting celebrities part. There are conventions put on by companies that, you know, do set up conventions and then have these big names, and that's kind of how they get people to come in the door. But a lot of the cons, if you haven't been to them, and obviously you have, but the people watching the video, if you haven't, you know, the ones that are in your local community, they're run by volunteers. These are people who just do it because they love film, or they love horror, or they love costuming, or whatever it is, it's their thing. And so, you know, they give up their time and they, you know, raise the money, and they have somebody's taking care of the bank account, and, you know, someone's running the gaming room, and someone's running the dealer's room, and someone's tracking the, you know, the programming or whatever. And, you know, they have glitches here and there, but basically, you know, the ones I've been to more or less run pretty well, and these are the people who just do it because they love to. And those are the kind of places where you can meet a lot of people, sometimes celebrities, but Celebrities usually require being paid, so and not, these local cons often can't afford that. But maybe people who aren't really big, but someone who was an extra in something, or someone who wrote your favorite novel might be there, and you can meet them and chat with them till 3 in the morning at the bar or something, and you can make those connections with people you never thought you would meet. So maybe you've met people you think you hadn't thought that you would have met, or had a 3 a.m. bar conversation with or something. But those are the kind of things you remember, right?
Yeah. One of the things that I think is so exciting about the horror fandom in particular for me is that, the people that I know who are big, like I just showed you a poster from I Drink Your Blood. Now, I don't know how many people know that film, but the people I talk to know that film. You know what I mean? So it's already a community of people who care about something like that. And you're exactly right. So, because it's not quite as mainstream, it is, the people there are more accessible. Like I remember I was standing next to the star of the Basket Case films at one of the Crypticons one year. We were just watching a heavy metal band play and just stood there and kind of chatted about that. And here I'm talking to a guy from a film that I'm really, really, really fond of. And it doesn't create that distance. I'm so much of a fan of the smaller, more specific conventions. Cinema Wasteland that I mentioned, it's 1,000 to 2,000 people maximum. It all takes place in a Holiday Inn, and I travel to Cleveland twice a year so I can do it. I'm going to Monster Bash for the first time. Everybody tells me that's the Cinema Wasteland for classic monster enthusiasts, of which I'm hugely one. I'm a big Universal monster guy. So, I think that the bigger conventions are interesting. I find them a little less useful for me, I guess. I find them, I think that they're an important part of it, obviously, because they allow us to be, I think they create a culture in the United States of fandom that makes it okay and makes more people interested in branching out and keeps the smaller conventions alive. The big convention here locally in the St. Louis region, the convention Archon that happens every year, I always think how much it's grown, and how much there's new fans coming into it all the time. And it's really interesting to me to watch new people show up. And I've always sort of just I'm not like a big participant in it, but it's a convention, so I'm going to it and it's local. But I've watched from sort of a distance as younger people constantly cycle through, and I think you need that bigger acceptance of it. Otherwise, what happens, I think you see that happen with some of these local fan events, they become very insular, and then they kind of just, the group of people just ages out, whereas it's been great to see some of the local stuff, some of the local fandom continue to have that original core set of people who made it happen, and then new people being added all the time to keep it alive.
Yeah, so if you're local to St. Louis, Archon happens usually the first weekend or maybe the second weekend of October, but if you go to, I think it's archon.com, I think is their page. You can go there and find out, assuming that things are relatively back to normal after virus apocalypse right now in the spring of 2020. But Archon is a big local one. We used to have one, Name That Con, that lasted for 10 or 13 years. Gateway, we had that for like 3 or 4 years, but Archon's been the one that had the staying power.
Yeah.
And it's still going on, so you can always look at and see who's showing up. Usually it's more of a con oriented toward authors, so their guest of honor is almost always a book author and not a like TV show person or something. But yeah, you can have a lot of fun at Archon, meeting people and just looking at the hall costumes and whatever. So yeah. So have you attended before then? You have gone to Archons in the past? Perhaps when it was back at the Henry VIII with ample parking lot D in the back. Or even before then when it was at the Regal downtown.
Yeah. I went to the Henry VIII, I think, once, and then most of my Archoning has been over the last 10 years. I kind of got away from it for a long time as I got involved in the local music scene, going to see a lot of bands for a long time, and that just swallowed up most of my extracurricular time. And then I kind of got back into it, I guess, around 2008 or so. I kind of started finding my way back over there. But it was pretty firmly in Collinsville by the time I was going all the time. But yeah, and again, you know, science fiction and science fiction and fantasy are not things that I have been a huge fan of, but I'm such a huge fan of fandom that, you know, I'm fascinated with I just love to talk to people who get into making things and, you know, being involved in things. And then Archon has had a couple of things that I was interested in here or there. Gil Gerard from the original Buck Rogers, not the original, but the Buck Rogers TV show in the 80s was a high point of Archon for me. He was an interesting guy to get to stand and talk to. But more than that, I think, you know, the guys who make foam costumes or the people who do interesting art. I mean, I've got a piece of art on my wall right here that I bought at Archon from a local artist named Paul Daly, who, you know, I loved the piece and I bought it off of him there, and I still love the piece. There's a lot of, like you said, there's a lot of those little local conventions. I don't think there's anything wrong with the big ones. I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to meet the big celebrities. I just find that it's a little bit more stifled. I've been to Dragon Con 3 or 4 times, I guess, and that's just difficult. You know, it's 70,000 people. It's hard to move around. But it's interesting because there's that much going on. There's so much programming that you can really find little niches of programming that I think are really interesting. But I'm probably not going to be going to Archon much anymore because Archon falls on the same weekend as Cinema Wasteland, I've discovered. So I've been making my way up to Ohio the last few years. And like I said, that has just, it's expanded my mind and expanded my horizons a whole lot. And that's pretty exciting. It's exciting that a community can help you do that, you know? That's what I think I keep coming back to, is the sense of like, wow, when I get with these people, the energy there is not like any other group of people that I know, you know? And so I'm fascinated with that. And then I'm fascinated with people's stories. So the documentary that I'm making, I'm really trying to track both the history of horror fandom back to, I really think that the modern horror fandom, even though we could probably say there's proto-fandom in the science fiction community that you and I have talked about, it really doesn't start until the mid to late 1950s. A bunch of things start to happen that all coalesce at the sort of the same moment that make it possible. And then it starts to die a little bit. Star Wars happens and really starts killing the horror genre in general for a bit. And then all of a sudden Fangoria magazine just kind of happens, and that just revs everything back up, and the advent of home video. So I'm fascinated with all that and the history pieces. You know, if there had been a viable way for me to go to school just to be a history major, that I could have done something that I understood how to do that, I might have gone to school for that. But then the other side of it, like I said, is cultural. And I have an interest in sort of the anthropology of this thing as well, you know, and the sociology of this thing. So how do these cultures come together, and what do they mean when they come together, and what does it mean for the people involved, you know? So I'm really interested in exploring that with other people.
Okay, that sounds fascinating. I hope to see your documentary when you finish it.
It'll be a little while, but yeah, I'll let you know.
All right, thanks for joining me for this episode of Getting Nosy with It. If you like this video, hit like and subscribe. And if you want, hit that little bell notification so you can be informed when I put more videos online. I will talk to you next time. Bye-bye.